Hi, everyone. My name is Libby Jamison, and I am excited to be here to talk to you about overcoming occupational licensing barriers for military families. This is a topic that I am very passionate about, and I realize that not a lot of folks are also passionate about occupational licensing. I've certainly had the conversations where I see the boredom and setting in on folks' faces, but I think it's a really important topic for military families to understand how to overcome these barriers. And so I am excited to be here to talk about this with you today. I hope that you are excited as well, and I hope that you leave feeling better educated and better equipped to deal with these issues. So thank you to the Veteran Employment and Transition Summit folks for including me and for including this important topic. Just to do a little level setting, I want to talk about what we're going to cover today. So I want to start just with a little bit of background and talk about where we are as a country when it comes to occupational licensing, give a little bit of history there. Then we're going to talk about military families, where military families stand, and resources for military families. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can do with your voice as a military spouse, as a military family member, to help push back on some of these issues and remove these barriers for all of us. So I'm very passionate about advocacy, so we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end as well. But get started here. I always start with my own story so folks understand part of why I am so passionate about these issues. I am an attorney. I'm also a proud Navy spouse. My husband has been in for almost 25 years at this point. I've been along for the ride for almost 20 years since we met at University of Washington. He had enlisted after high school. We met at University of Washington when he was going through to get his degree and commission. I was not a lawyer at the time. I was finished up my undergrad and then we got married, and I went to law school after we were married. And I will talk about this a little bit more, but about decision making and career paths. I went to law school. We were fortunate enough to be in San Diego long enough for me to go to school. I passed the California bar. I also took the Washington State bar exam because I thought that was my home state. I thought the Navy would send us back there at some point, which of course they have not. And got my first job and eventually started my own firm in San Diego. And that, of course, is when the Navy decided it was time for the Jamisons to head to Florida. So after about 10 years in San Diego, we moved across country. And that was when reality of military spouse life as a working military spouse set in for me. And we then did about 4 moves in 6 years. And that is tough for anyone to bounce around that much. It's especially difficult if you're trying to build a career and maintain employment, and especially if that employment requires licensing that's done on a state-to-state level. So after our move to Florida, I had a really tough time trying to decide whether to take the Florida bar exam, shell out a bunch of money, spend a bunch of time, be really stressed out for a while to take an exam, and then hope that somebody would hire me all for a 2-year period. So I really struggled. I struggled with my identity, my professional identity. What was I going to do with my life? And I found a group, we'll talk about this a little more as well, but started working with a group called the Military Spouse JD Network, where I found some really helpful support professionally and personally to help me make those decisions. And I did not end up taking the Florida bar exam. It just did not make sense. And I think a lot of military spouses can relate to those barriers that sometimes prevent us from working after a PCS. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but I want to dive in. And like I said, do a little bit of level setting here to begin with and talk about occupational licensing in the States in general. So, once upon a time in America, we were not so heavily regulated when it came to professional licensing. And then, bar exams started. Certainly, you want folks who are doing open heart surgery, maybe dealing with the electrical, and there are public safety reasons to have occupational licensing in place to ensure that folks are being safe and not harming themselves or others on the job. So although I advocate a lot to reduce these barriers, it's not to say that there shouldn't be any occupational licensing, but that the licensing should do what they say it does, which is look out for public safety. And instead, a lot of the times, it seems very protectionist and more about keeping people out than keeping people safe. And so that's where the concern comes in. And there's a lot of other expense. Is it keeping people out of practicing certain professions because the cost to break in is so extreme? Certainly, I'll keep referring to the legal profession because that's what I'm most familiar with. But you're talking thousands of dollars. The exam is only offered every 6 months. There's some serious financial barriers there. And so can that licensing be done in a better way to make sure that everybody has access to these professions? But you can see from here, from this slide, that the share of workers in the US needing a license at the state level, that's where most of the occupational licensing is imposed, has increased fivefold since the 1950s. So that's a pretty drastic increase. And we're going to talk more about which professions and how that's implemented a little bit, but you can see there that that's a pretty big number. So about a quarter of US workers now require a license to practice their trade or their craft. So keep that number in mind because we're going to talk about that a little bit more. That's a little bit on numbers wise where we are with licensing in the US. And continuing to talk broadly, occupational licensing is generally imposed at the state level. So there are some national credentials, but generally each state, states' rights are firmly established. Each state has the right to protect public safety in their jurisdiction and say how someone can or cannot practice a trade in their state. So it is generally state to state when you're looking at cosmetology, truck drivers, lawyers, doctors. A lot of that is nursing, medical profession, teaching. A lot of that is regulated on the state level. And that is more and more of a challenge, I think, as we are more and more of a interconnected society, right? So such a virtual society now, even pre-COVID, you could set up shop and be working in multiple states. It's not the olden days where you are in one small town and you probably never leave that small town as far as your business. You now have the ability to reach much more broadly than that. And I would say I don't think licensing has kept up with that because we're still on this fairly antiquated state by state structure. And the problem with that then is that it's not always easily transferable, right? So even if you are licensed in California, you want to do business in Florida, you're moving to Florida, or because of the internet, you're able to take on clients in Florida. Does Florida even accept a California license? Do you have to start from scratch? That was my story. Was Florida did not have reciprocity with California. They did not accept a California bar license. I would have to take the bar exam as if I was an attorney that had never practiced before, and pay a bunch of fees, wait 6 months, take the exam. And so the portability piece is certainly a challenge when we're in this state by state structure. So I think it's important for folks to understand what is required in each jurisdiction, and that can take a lot of research. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. But understand that not every jurisdiction even licenses the same thing. So it's this massive patchwork. And, North Carolina, you can see here, has 200 licensed occupations. Louisiana has 77. So while most states are going to regulate, nurses, doctors, lawyers, teachers, there's a core that is, regulated across all of the states. That's not true for every profession. So you may be a physical trainer or nutritionist in one state and not required to have a license with that state. But if you go to another jurisdiction, you are required to be licensed. So obviously very important for mobile populations like military families. Understand that although you may not be required in one jurisdiction to have a license, that may change in a different jurisdiction. And maybe it goes the opposite way. Maybe you move somewhere where you are not required to be licensed, but that's really important to be aware of. So yeah, kind of talking more a little bit about the challenges for military families when we look at that structure and how occupational licensing is set up in the United States. We can see that does pose a lot of challenges for military families. So obviously frequent relocations, you're having to get licensed over and over again. That is a challenge. Timing wise, do you get your orders ahead of time far enough that you can start the process and hopefully hit the ground running and be licensed? Or does it take a significant amount of time and you're eating into that 2 or 3 years, where you might only have a limited window in each jurisdiction? The expenses add up if you're relicensing over and over again. And just I think the stress of it and the disruption. It is hard to build a meaningful career when you are starting over again and having to prove yourself over and over again outside of the licensing issues. But so certainly the frequent relocations that are part of the military lifestyle are not necessarily helpful on the military spouse career side of things. Deployments and training schedules, again, that disruption. If you're solo parenting and trying to go through a relicensing or licensing process, especially we know we don't always get a lot of notice for these trainings and debts, that can be a challenge. Like I said, the bar exam's only offered twice a year. So if something pops up and you can't make the bar exam that day, or whatever licensing test it might be, you may be waiting for quite a while. And when we're only somewhere 2 or 3 years, we don't always have that time to wait and for the next test. So that can be a challenge. Childcare availability and costs. We hear this almost every discussion that we have, not so much on the licensing piece, but on the greater employment issues for military spouses. And certainly it is the calculation when you're looking at, am I going to spend all this time and money to become relicensed and go back to work, knowing that the cost of childcare, does that make sense for you in that financial calculation that you're doing? So especially going somewhere, maybe you have lost employment because of a relocation and are trying to decide whether it makes sense to go through that whole process somewhere where maybe childcare is obscenely expensive. Does it make sense to go back to work and to get relicensed and go back to work? And I would say, I hope to hear from folks. I know there's a forum chat open for this session. So I hope folks will go in there and share, what some of your challenges have been maybe some of what your successes have been. How have you overcome those challenges? What worked for you? What might work for other military families? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I think that's a really important piece, is sharing what's worked for us, talking about these challenges and how have we overcome them. And for folks who have been successful, what hasn't worked and what has worked. So look forward to hearing from folks in the forum, sharing your experiences. Okay, so let's see here. DoD knows that this is a problem, and that's a step forward, right? There have been a lot of advocates over the years, many incredible military spouses and advocates stepping up to make sure that DoD is paying attention and aware of these issues, and they are tracking. You can see here, as of 2018, DoD had the active duty spouse unemployment rate at about 24%, which is much higher than the national average. Now, this is pre-COVID. I think I saw that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was looking post-COVID at about a 35% unemployment rate. So we know that COVID is disproportionately impacting women in the workplace, and about 90% of military spouses are women. So it's no surprise that we're seeing that number go up due to the impact of the pandemic. So not a great number, but important that DoD is tracking it, and that this is on their radar. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So you can see that here, about 34% of employed spouses required licenses to work, according to DoD. Again, this is 2018 numbers. But I think that's a really interesting number when you go back and think about that first slide we were looking at that talked about overall about a quarter of the US workforce requires a license. So actually a higher percentage of military spouses require a license to work than the general workforce, which is really interesting to me. And I think at first I was surprised. I was like, man, wouldn't spouses be trying to avoid these professions that require a license? But thinking back to my own experience, like I said, I went to law school after we got married. And I have to be honest and say, I did not fully think through the licensing piece of it. So I thought about it. I just thought, well, there's attorneys everywhere, right? Like I can get a job anywhere because lawyers are everywhere. People would probably say there's too many lawyers all over the place. But I thought, that's going to be great. There's law attorney jobs everywhere. I'll be fine. And did not fully factor in how painful it would be to continue taking the bar exam over and over again. And so I think that a lot of spouses are probably maybe had a similar thought process. I also think a lot of spouses work, we have hearts for service a lot of times, just like our service members want to step up and serve our country. We want to serve and give back to our communities. And so I don't think it's surprising that we find military spouses are predominantly employed in healthcare, taking care of others, giving back, and education. And I think, we hear teachers and nurses. There's also teachers and nurses everywhere. And so that's something that would make sense for military spouses. My hope is these licensing barriers are removed, and this is not a conversation we have to continue having. But I also hope that until that happens, we can have these discussions, especially with spouses who are maybe rethinking a career path, or newer, younger military spouses coming into this community, and really talk about, yes, I went to law school. I did not realize how challenging that was going to be. And so can we help military spouses think about careers that do not require such stringent licensing? So there has been some great work. I know Salesforce They have just fantastic program to help military spouses become Salesforce certified. That is an incredibly portable career. And so start thinking about some of these options where those licensing barriers don't exist. So if you are re-entering the workforce, maybe recreating your professional path, I do think that is something that's important to think about. Either finding a career where maybe there's licensing, but it is more portable, there's more reciprocity, there's not as many delays, or a path that just doesn't require licensing at all. So until we can solve the occupational licensing barrier problems, I think that's a really key educational message to get out there to spouses who are working on their careers, so that they don't face these barriers like we all have. So continuing to talk about DoD and their approach to this problem, because I think they really have embraced this issue and recognized that in order to recruit and retain the best and brightest service members, those folks are going to be married to the best and the brightest. You know, we have some really amazing rock star military spouses who want to support their service member. I know I am so incredibly proud of my husband and his service and just the incredible sacrifices he makes to serve in the Navy. And I want to support that. But I would also like to be able to build my own career. And I don't think that's too much to ask. And I think DoD is seeing the impact that that is going to have, where service members may not stick around if their spouse, if mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, right? But if the spouse has other career opportunities, that may have an impact on the service member's service. And DoD has put a lot of money into training my husband, and I know they want to keep him around. And so their work on this is incredibly important. And I always include this 2018 memo because I still remember when it came out. I was so excited. I was texting it around to all my friends who are also licensing nerds like me. And we were just so happy to see this in writing. You know, DoD had been working already on a lot of these licensing barriers. There really is bipartisan support on this. It's something that the Obama administration worked on through their Joining Forces initiative. The Trump administration has continued to push for reducing these barriers. State legislators from both sides of the aisle have approached these issues to solve them for military families and more broadly. So there's a ton of support for this, but I don't remember really seeing anything this stark in writing before from DoD. They sent this memo to the National Governors Association and said, we are going to start looking at two things when we decide where we're going to put our money. They're putting their money where their mouth is, right? Where are we going to put our money and our troops and our resources going forward? We're going to look at whether your state offers portability, licensing portability to military spouses. And we're also going to look at the quality of education. So what are the schools like around the bases and where military families live? And so this was just really fantastic to see them put it in writing to the governors and say, this is an issue we need you to address on the state level to make things better for military families. And you can see they say eliminating or mitigating these barriers will improve quality of life for our military families and ease the stress of transferring duty stations with consideration for long-term career implications. So I cannot tell you how happy that sentence made me, how happy this entire memo made me. And I think governors, a lot of folks have taken it to heart as well. And we'll, let's see, go to the map here. You can see DoD has state liaison offices, and these liaisons go out and talk to the states about things like spouse employment and what the states can do to improve this crazy patchwork. So you can still see, obviously it is still very much a patchwork. But this is a great map from the Department of Labor's website. You can go on there. I have the link in here later, and click on each state and it'll pull up the law for that state. Now, I think it's important to note that that law does not always apply to all military spouses. So what the legislature did, say, I'm trying to think, Washington, doesn't always apply for certain professions that are sometimes regulated outside of the legislative process. So attorneys, I know I keep talking about attorneys, that's what I know. We are regulated by the state court. And sometimes teachers are regulated through a different board or commission or process. So it's just important to understand there is a little bit of a limitation on this map, but it is a really useful place to start your research, to see what the rules and regulations are in your state and see where your state stands. And sometimes it's important to say, like, look, the legislature has passed something in the state. Now, it doesn't apply to me as a teacher, but I'm going to go to the board and say, why haven't you guys done anything? Clearly, the state has acted, and my one profession is carved out here, but you guys need to step up to the plate and fix this as well. So it's good to kind of know what has and hasn't passed in the state. So a really useful tool here. Another thing that the DoD has done with their state liaisons is really support these state licensing compacts. So that map we just looked at was going state by state. California does this, Nevada does this, Arizona does this. They all have their different rules. What the compacts do is bring a group of states together. So California, Nevada, Arizona can come together and say, we agree that once you have a nursing license in California, you're good for these other states. And some of them are very large compacts. So that's a really important thing to be on the lookout for as well. You may not even have to transfer a license. You may just have right to practice, privilege to practice capabilities just by virtue of already being licensed in one of the compact states. So some of the compacts just make it easier to transfer. Some of them actually give you right to practice capabilities. So these compacts are really fantastic, and a way for state, instead of having to do the state by state process, just a whole bunch of states come together and agree. And DoD has been really supportive of that, making sure the folks working on these issues understand how important these compacts are for military families. So you can see here they're continuing to work on physical therapy, nursing, EMS, psych, audiology. There's a lot of these compacts in the work, but just like with those state by state efforts, it is still a profession by profession. So it takes some time to go through each one, but a great thing to be on the lookout for as you're transferring your license. So licensing resources. Like I said, Department of Labor, that's where I pulled that map from. If you go to their military spouses page, it's very interactive and they have a bunch of other resources on there as well. So that's a great place to start. One of the most important resources that I give out on a host of issues is Military OneSource. So I hope everyone knows through Military OneSource, you can get free non-medical counseling, tax services, tax support. There are just so many fantastic resources through Military OneSource. I hope everyone just has that bookmarked and uses the heck out of all those resources, because there's some really great ones there. And one of those is the Spouse Education and Career Opportunities, a SECO program. And they have, again, so many great resources on the employment front. There is information on employers who have partnered with DoD to hire military spouses. So some fantastic information there. But relevant to the conversation today is their portion on licensing and certifications. So hopefully you pull up that page on Military OneSource, and just a ton of information, including reimbursement information that we'll talk about here in a minute. But what I wanted to highlight was they offer free career coaching. So I think that's really, again, a just fantastic free resource that everyone should be taking advantage of. And what I would advise if you are looking at transferring a license is call and talk to them, because they have helped a lot of military spouses, figure out the licensing information for where you're going, who the right contacts are, what the process is, that kind of thing. So they can be a really helpful guide on that journey. Cannot say enough about SECO. So definitely add that to your toolkit. The other resource that I think is really, really important, because I know how much it helped me out when I was really struggling in Florida with what I was going to do with my life and my career. I would not be here talking to you today if I had not stumbled across Military Spouse JD Network. So that is a group of all military spouses who are also attorneys. And they were dealing with the exact same thing I was, how am I going to transfer my license? How am I going to continue my career? Can I still be a lawyer when I'm married to someone in the military? Is that even possible? How do I make it work? And if I decide not to work, is that okay? How do you re-enter the workforce? Just a lot of really important conversations. But MSJDN also does a ton of work on the licensing piece. So going state to state, asking for those licensing accommodations to make it easier to transfer, so you don't have to keep taking the bar exam over and over again. And MSJDN is not the only specialty group for military spouses. There's a military spouses in STEM, there's behavioral health clinicians. So, and National Military Family Association has Facebook groups for military spouse teachers and nurses. So those are just an incredible resource in general, but also for licensing questions, because you can go into these groups and say, I'm licensed in Florida. I'm about to go to Washington State. Who has done that? How long did it take? Talk me through the process. When should I start the application? And all of those questions. So an incredible resource there. I think my friends and I call it the military spouse mafia. You can get everything you need, all the information you need, all the support you need from our community. And they really understand that intersection, right? I had friends who were attorneys and friends who were military spouses, but folks who are really at that intersection have experienced how those two worlds collide it's just priceless advice. So highly recommend getting involved in one of those groups. And if there isn't a specialty group for your specific profession, start one. MSJDN started as a Facebook group with like 2 or 3 people. And now it's a National Bar Association with a nonprofit foundation and does a ton of good work, pro bono services for Gold Star families. And it all started in a Facebook group. So I would say start one, or connect with Hiring Our Heroes has military spouse professional networks, MSPNs, that are geographically based rather than by profession. So you can plug in if you're in San Diego or Virginia Beach, or I know they even have, Okinawa, Bahrain. You can plug into those groups. It's just generally career-minded military spouses, and connect and network with folks in that way. So it's not specific to your profession, but still a great resource. And lastly, on this list, I included state boards and commissions. They are generally going to be the folks who have the official information that you need, the forms that you need to fill out to apply. I have found, they are not always the most military culturally competent folks. They may not understand what a PCS is, and that this is the 4th time that you're getting relicensed. I think there's a lot of work to do there, but many of them are working to address that. And they're just somebody that you're going to have to interact with and deal with. So make sure they're on your list of resources, and you are prepared to tell your story and interact with them, whether they understand our unique military lifestyle or not. So I throw this in here just to highlight what I think is the importance of the of our military community networks. I know I harped on that on the last slide, so I won't talk about it too much, but I do think these personal and professional connections that you can make beyond the licensing issues. You'll see here spouses are asking about, how do I do my interview by Skype? They're sharing jobs. They're talking about what it's like to leave a job. And so I would just really encourage everyone to plug in for that. Whether you're about to transfer a license or not, start building those connections. And I think you'll find that support invaluable. So paying for a license is, we've talked about it a little bit. The good news is DoD now reimburses up to $1,000 if you have to get relicensed after a PCS. If you go to the Military OneSource page, they have the rules because, of course, every branch implemented their own process for how you apply for this reimbursement. But all that information is on a Military OneSource page that talks about licensing and certifications. And so make sure you utilize this. This is a great benefit, and hopefully it helps reduce some of those financial concerns, especially when you may not be working during a transition. So you do have to pay upfront for it and then apply for reimbursement. But we've heard great things about the program, and so definitely take advantage of that. The other resources, Army Emergency Relief was offering up to $2,500 as either a loan or a grant, depending on your financial situation, for military spouses dealing with career disruption. And having to get relicensed or rehired after a military relocation. And then the last one that I think is really great and has been around for some time is the National Military Families Association, NMFA, scholarship funding. So this is just, it's open year round. You can apply. It is not limited to just relicensing expenses. So you can use it for continued education, if you need supervision in your licensing process at all, for the underlying degree or certification, for recertification. So that is a fantastic resource. NMFA has been an incredible advocate on these issues. So certainly check out their website, and the scholarship information is there. So kind of a recap and a little bit of a checklist, because I know our military community loves checklists. If you are facing a potential, I guess I wrote relicensing, this really could be licensing or relicensing process. And this is kind of how I run through it, starting with research. If you're like me, you know, my husband comes home and says, okay, well, they're starting to narrow it down. We've got like maybe 3 or 4 places that we could end up. And I'm already Googling, you know, looking at the licensing requirements for those different locations, pulling up Zillow, checking out all the housing, and you know, doing the comparison, right? You know, which one is going to work out best on my end of things. And so again, that's where I think those DoD and DOL resources can come in handy. You can start pulling up the rules and regulations for the different jurisdictions where you're headed, talk to your peer groups, you know, go into the Facebook group and say, hey, we're looking at either, you know, Rhode Island or Florida. What has been your experience there? What's the job market like there? What was the licensing process like there? So just starting to gather information. Once maybe you have a better idea, you can reach out and confirm with the board or commission, the folks who actually have the final say so, and talk to them, make sure you are correct in your assumptions and your research as far as what's going to be required, and figure out the timing and the cost and all of those good things. And then once you're ready, you can submit your application to transfer your license. And my advice here is to always ask for the waiver, even if they tell you there isn't a military spouse accommodation. I think it's important to tell your story, explain why this is a hardship. You know, this is the third time we've relocated. I'm having to pay for this license again. And ask for consideration, you know, for the processing to be expedited, for a reduction in the fee, whatever it might be. I think the only way the worst I can say is no. But you're also serving as an advocate for the families that are going to come behind you by bringing up these issues. So maybe it's successful for you, and you're also bringing these issues to the attention of these boards and commissions. You know, we had worked on an attorney licensing accommodation in Washington State for many, many years. And the Oversight Association kept telling us, we think the current licensing structure is sufficient. We don't see a need for a military spouse license. And we kept saying, you know, we're talking to the military spouses. We know this need exists. Here's why your current rules are insufficient. And it just wasn't going anywhere. And we finally had success with the court enacting a licensing rule for military spouses. And within the first year, 7 military spouses used that rule. So even though the board thought that there was no need for it, clearly there was. They just weren't hearing it because nobody was asking. So I think it's really important to ask for these waivers. You know, tell them that you're a military family, explain why it's a hardship. And you're, again, even if you aren't successful, which I hope that you are, you're laying the groundwork for the future. So don't bypass that opportunity. We'll make you all into advocates, whether you want to be or not. And the last thing is follow up. So once you've submitted, hopefully it's a quick process. Hopefully you hear back before you're even thinking about it again. But if you don't, definitely follow up, continue to let them know, you know, we're only here for a couple years. I really need this, you know, as quickly as possible. Be polite, but be persistent, and continue to follow up with them. Don't just let it sit somewhere. So don't be shy about that. Again, you don't have to spam them every day. But follow up every once in a while, every other week, you know, especially if they've told you, look, this is going to take 2 weeks and you don't hear from them in 2 weeks. Don't be shy about pinging them. And the other thing I will say about follow up is, or really any of these steps, if you face pushback from these folks that you think is not appropriate, so, you know, maybe you ask for a waiver or an accommodation because I just convinced you that that's the right path to take, and they say no. Okay, but if they deny your license and you're reading the rule and you're like, I don't understand this, I feel like I should qualify, I have read through everything, and I don't understand why they haven't granted this. Do not be afraid to engage your representatives, your state representative. So generally this is going to be a state issue. So you'll go to like a state senator, a state representative, or assembly person. And we had a military spouse who was trying to transfer a license from North Carolina to Pennsylvania and was getting a ton of pushback in Pennsylvania. And we couldn't really understand why, because it seemed like she qualified for everything. And so I said, why don't you reach out to your Pennsylvania representative? They hadn't actually moved there yet. She was still in North Carolina, but they knew where they were going. And so she reached out to her future representative and said, can you and your staff help me look into this and figure out what's going on? And I think they put in an official inquiry. And, you know, a couple weeks later, she had a positive response. So I don't think it hurts to engage those folks. That's what they do. They're constituent services staff. this is what they work on all the time. A lot of times they have relationships with these boards and commissions already and can help you figure out those answers. So I know a lot of times military families are kind of hesitant, think, well, I don't vote there, they're not going to help me. But no, I think you'll be surprised to find how much these folks want to help you out. So don't be afraid to engage them and ask for that help if you think something just doesn't seem right, or you can't get an answer. Reach out to your representative. So that kind of brings us to the end. I did want to talk, like I said, a little bit about advocacy, because I think military spouses, we have such powerful stories and voices, and I hope that everyone will engage and not be afraid to tell your stories. And I use this graphic because I think it shows the power of our voices when we come together. This was the map in 2012 of the states that had accommodations, licensing accommodations for military spouse attorneys. And as you can see, 2 states, right? 2012. And this is 2019. I actually think we have a couple more from this year. MSJDN has continued to work on these issues, Rhode Island and Alabama and Delaware. And so you can see, I just love this. I mean, look at all that red go away. It's fantastic. But that does not happen if we don't step in and tell our stories and ask the states to help us out. And I always say, we're not asking for special treatment here. We're not asking to get out of the licensing process entirely. But we are competent and we are capable. And once we have passed, 3 bar exams, do we really need to keep taking the bar exam over and over again to show you that we're competent to work in your state? And so I hope that folks will kind of be inspired by this and plug in your profession, whatever that might be. Hopefully there's an existing group. If not, maybe this is your call to action to build that group. And this is where I want to be 10 years from now, where we're just green all over for all the states, all the professions, and we no longer have these barriers for military spouses. So with that, I'll leave my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions. You can reach out to me directly or leave them in the forum chat. And I wish everyone the best on your military spouse career journey, and may you have smooth sailing and fair winds and no licensing barriers to hold you back. Thank you.